Well, all right, now that I have these changes worked out, and I'm gonna pick between these two, and I'm gonna pick this one as my favorite. They have very similar execution times measured with statistic.io. I think this version is going to be easier to understand and maintain than the pivot is, and it certainly performs just as well in my testing. So I am going to drop my temp tables and then populate some changes into a new procedure called Tune Me Revised. That's just so if I want to run the old procedure, I still have it around. This is just a test system. This could be ready for review. Of course, if I'm using real version control, I may not need to make this a new procedure, et cetera, right? Not saying don't use version control. But there's other important improvements that I've done in here as well. I have added a debug mode with related code. This is really useful because it can make that whole problem of which of these is running slow, it can make that problem super trivial. Now, I've only done a very lightweight version of the debug code. What I've done is I have a parameter. Now, technically, this is what I've added is underscore debug is what I've added. I do run on a case-sensitive instance, so that matters. I've added this as a parameter here. It defaults to 0. So by default, this does not run in debug mode, and the debug code will not run. I'm a big believer in this, in part since the system that I learned SQL Server on, the application that I learned it on, this was a well-documented pattern, and it made managing that system so much easier in all of the stored procedures. I have code throughout here that says I am going to, if debug equals 1, I am going to have a custom message explaining what point I'm at right now, and I'm going to do something with it. Now, in this case, I'm just using raise error with no way to print it out. Now, that's not bad. If I'm running this from a job in that system I learned on, a lot of the big procedures that could take a while were run from SQL agent jobs, and this would be included in the logs. But depending on what you're working on, you might want your debug code to also log something to a table or to log something inside the SQL Server. It really depends on the whole nature of the system you're working on, how frequent logging is going to be, different requirements. So in this case, we're just printing it to the messages, but in other systems, you might want to log it in a different way. So you can make this fancier, but we are including things like what time is it? And in my case, I'm also doing on things after the first message. The first message just says, hey, what time is it? Here's what I did. But when we get to the next one, we are also figuring out how long has it been since the last message, just so that you don't have to, when you're rolling through the list, do a bunch of, okay, this minus that in terms of the time. It's just, if we're going to go ahead and log, we may as well be very polite about how we include the duration as well. And I'm putting how many milliseconds, in this case, it's been between commands at the end of the message. Having this in is going to make life much easier in terms of how long did different parts of this take. I also have removed the unused columns from the page numbers table so that we don't have extra baggage in there. All right, so I'm going to shrink this down and create the procedure. And of course, also, perhaps it's important as well to say that at the end of this, I have swapped in the tuned queries, and in the middle, everything is now using page numbers instead of populating 5 different temp tables. We're just populating one temp table, and then here at the end, we are querying it with the version that uses case. Now, hopefully, I have actually successfully gotten rid of all those literals I used, right? And I've got my parameters back into play. Really tricky to make sure that I haven't, in tuning things, messed something up. Testing is important, kids, especially for my code. So, okay, I have Tune Me Revised created there. And first up, I'm going to test this with the code that was originally fast. And I'm running this in the same sequence too. I mean, sometimes parameter sniffing can be an issue. Sometimes the issue can be that if we run this first with certain parameters and then reuse the code, reusing it can be slow. So let's test that. I'm going to run this first with the parameters that were run that it was fast with before. And I have made a mistake. It is still a problem to run this with execution plans enabled because I still have that loop in there. So let's disable actual plans and go ahead and run this. I thought I'd gotten better about not accidentally leaving plans on. I was mistaken. So this runs still in less than 1 second when we run it for the fast version. Now I'm going to run it for the version the parameters that used to be slow. This used to take a minute to run, but now this takes 5 seconds to run, or at least on this run, it took 5 seconds. Looking at my messages tab, it's even better right now that I've added that. And I am running these, by the way, with debug equals 1 now, so that in my messages tab, I can see, okay, the query that I tuned, yeah, the whole thing took 4 seconds, but this part of it, I can see without having to dig into query store, the execution plan cache, et cetera, et cetera. I can see, okay, that part of it took 282 milliseconds. Adding the rows took 1.6 seconds. And creating the index took, 422 milliseconds. And this piece right here running the reorg took 2 seconds. So I can see that now at this point in the tuning, the part that I just tuned, I don't necessarily want to spend too much more time tuning that because a lot of my duration is held in other parts of this. So that debug code in the stored procedure can be really, really super useful in terms of saving me from over-tuning things because now this is very minimally part of this. Now what I'm going to do here is just test it with even more rows. But actually, let's do this in a different way first. Let's go ahead and run this exec with recompile on the one who's slow. This one, in terms of what this query is doing, temp table usage can be weird in terms of plan reuse. So, and this is just one thing I often do when I'm testing procedures in general, is I want to know, what is it like when you reuse a plan for a very different amount of data? But then also, what is it like when you compile your own plan and maybe someone else reuses you, maybe they don't? Executing a procedure with recompile says, don't reuse any plans in cache. Don't leave your plan behind for someone else to use. So I am just going to go ahead and say, okay, if you got your own plan, how long do you take? Are you still fast, right? Does that one part of it still not take very long? We have an execution time of 5 seconds again. And this time, we're still in the 300 millisecond range for that last query. We've got, 2 seconds doing the reorg, 1.6 seconds adding rows, right? So we're still faster for tune me revised there. Now, one note about exec with recompile. In my testing, if you use nested stored procedures, the exec with recompile only applies to the outermost layer of the onion, but I don't have nested stored procedures in here. I do have some dynamic SQL going on in there, so that could be part of it. If I really wanted to be thorough, this is a dedicated test instance. I can clear out the procedure cache. So let's be a little more thorough. Let's go ahead and run dbcc free proc cache, which I think I think it's that number of words. No. Oh, I forget how many words dbcc free proc cache is. My memory's not perfect. So now that I've cleared out my procedure cache on my dedicated instance, so I haven't bothered anyone or anything, I'm going to run the slow version, put that in cache. It's getting its own plan for everything. Oh, we're up to 7 seconds this time. We're up to 8 seconds this time. I wonder if that was a fluke. In terms of, I think this may have been a little bit of a fluke. Our selecting data was fast, but our online rebuild was slow. This could be because during my online rebuild, other things happening on my VM made the instance busy. So let's rerun this again in terms of, were folks just waiting on the processors? Yeah. It took just 5 seconds this time. But certainly the query at the end has remained fast. And now I could say, oh, well, that plan is in cache. So you're still fast for the fast version. Woohoo! Boy, are you fast for the fast version. All right, and there's lots and lots we can play around with, but just for fun, let's go ahead and run the same. I haven't changed much from the previously slow sample here, but I have said instead of 100,000 rows, we're going to do 500,000 rows. So this is going to take a bit longer, but the beauty of having the ability to run it with that debug code, man, I'm so grateful for some of the habits I learned in that first work environment I was in, because looking at the output here, yeah, okay, now with that many rows, my final statement is 1.3 seconds. Okay, the bulk of this, yes, it took 25 seconds total, but okay, where do we spend our 25 seconds? We're predominantly spending it populating the table, and down here there's a 9-second one that the 9 seconds is reorganizing the index. As we're putting more rows in the index that we're doing maintenance on, adding the rows is taking longer with that loop, and then running the reorg and the different rebuilds are taking a while too. All right, cool. Well, if I want to look at, after I've tuned, if I want to look at what my execution plan looks like, it is still tricky to get actual plans. If by running the whole procedure, it's tricky to get actual plans, right? Because I got that loop in there still. Well, if I want to, I could get this from the query plan cache, of course. I could also get this from Query Store. So now I'm saying I want the plans from Query Store, from TuneMe Revised, and I'm saying, okay, I want the T-SQL that has case in it, because there's multiple queries in this proc. So I just, for convenience, I just want the queries for, or the plans that you have for the query that I've been tuning. I can see, and I do have a couple different plans for it, because in this case, I actually am getting different plans for small temp tables and big temp tables. And if I want to, I can look at, the T-SQL here I can look at. That is the T-SQL that I'm looking for. But I also can click on the query plan and look at, hey, what is this now? Yep, this looks just like what we saw when we were testing. So there's ways that Query Store, in cases like this with these complex procedures, there's ways that Query Store and the execution plan cache can be good for, hey, I want to check the cached plan or the Query Store plan for this, because getting the actual plan is still a little bit of a trick. I hope that you enjoyed this SQL challenge. And if you have other ideas on tuning the stored procedure, I would love to hear about them in the comments. Thanks for joining today, and I'll see you in another SQL challenge soon. I'm Kendra Little from SQLWorkbooks.com. Goodbye, folks.